Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Please consider subscribing and check out our Patreon for more. Enjoy the video. The raucous crowd roared as Teddy sashayed onto the makeshift stage, a vision in glittering gold and shimmering sequins. He reveled in the thunderous applause, spinning dramatically so his dress flared out, showing off his carefully crafted ensemble. This was his moment to shine. Offstage, he was just Theodore Jameson III, a quiet, unassuming young man who worked as a file clerk downtown. But here, under the bright lights with the pulsing jazz music blaring, he transformed into the stunning and vivacious Adora Allure, his drag persona. He lived for these secret nights, these glorious few hours where he could truly be himself, without having to hide or feel ashamed. By day, he put on the dull gray suit and hat, blending in like all the other office workers bustling along the New York City streets in 1922. But when night fell, he carefully applied his makeup, donned his wig and most fabulous outfit, and snuck out to the underground warehouse where the other queers gathered. It was the only place he felt he belonged. Growing up, he'd always been different, more interested in his mother's clothes and makeup than the rough sports and games the other boys played. His father, a stern, traditional man, had shamed and berated him, trying to toughen him up, make him normal. "You're no son of mine," his father had snarled in disgust when he caught Teddy wearing his sister's dress at age 15. He'd whipped Teddy with his belt, leaving angry red welts on his back and legs. After that, Teddy learned to hide his proclivities, to blend in, act normal. But the older he got, the more his true self strained to break free, like a bird beating its wings against the confines of a cage. When he moved out on his own at 18, he finally started exploring the hidden world of New York's secret community. He made some friends, other young men like himself, and they introduced him to the drag balls, thrilling, illicit events where men dressed up as their female alter egos and competed in categories like face and realness. The balls were a revelation, a glittering oasis where Teddy could leave the hard edges of masculinity behind and revel in his most feminine, glamorous impulses. He started spending all his extra money on wigs, heels, dresses, and makeup to create his drag persona, Adora Allure. Her style was old Hollywood glamour with a touch of burlesque cheekiness. The other queens marveled at how he could transform himself so completely. With his chiseled cheekbones, full lips, and long, graceful limbs, he made a stunningly beautiful woman. "Adora Allure," the MC announced as Teddy took his place at the end of the runway, ready for the face category. The crowd hooted and whistled their approval. He pursed his painted lips and batted his false eyelashes flirtatiously, making exaggerated model poses. For these few hours, he didn't have to be boring, awkward Theodore, the file clerk everyone overlooked and ignored. On stage, he was a star, drinking in the crowd's adoration, exhilarated by their cheers and applause. This was where he felt most alive, most himself. But it was a dangerous game they played. These men who loved other men, who found freedom and self-expression in women's clothes. If they were caught, the consequences could be dire. Police frequently raided gay bars and drag events, arresting the attendants, publishing their names in the papers. It could mean losing your job, your apartment, everything. 2 months ago, Teddy's friend Frankie was arrested in a sting operation at a known queer bar. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison for gross indecency. When he returned, he was a shell of his former vibrant self, skittish and radiating shame. He refused to come to the balls anymore. It terrified Teddy to imagine a similar fate. But the alternative, denying his true identity, his hard-fought, glittering feminine self, was unthinkable. He'd spent too many years choking on the dust of conformity and the ashes of repressed desire. He couldn't go back to hiding. Not anymore. And so he took precautions, never arrived at the balls until well after midnight, varied his routes and always checked for police. Had a male friend pose as his date in case the event was raided. That way he could claim he was just there with a girlfriend and avoid suspicion. It was exhausting looking over his shoulder all the time, jumping at every creak and footstep, feeling his heart seize in his chest at the distant wail of a police siren. But it was worth it for these incandescent moments on stage as Adora, living fully as his true self, even if it was only temporary. As the face competition ended, Teddy flounced off stage in a swirl of satin and chiffon to raucous applause. Several of his friends, also in drag, rushed over squealing and embracing him. "You were amazing as always," gushed Stella, a pretty queen in a red sequined gown. "That new wig is divine," Teddy smiled, still buzzing from the high of performing. "Thanks, doll. I had to bat my eyelashes at quite a few gentlemen to afford her, but it was worth every penny." They giggled conspiratorially, their camaraderie strengthened by the shared danger of their very existence. In this glittering bubble, surrounded by others like themselves, it was almost possible to forget the hostile, condemning world outside. But reality intruded all too soon. As Teddy was touching up his makeup in the makeshift dressing room, a shrill whistle pierced the air, followed by shouts of, "Police! Run!" Icy fear squeezed Teddy's heart. He leaped up, mascara wand clattering to the floor, and fled for the back exit. All around him was chaos, shrieks, sobs, the crash of overturned furniture, the pounding of feet. Policemen's angry bellows echoed against the walls. Teddy hitched up his skirts and ran as fast as his heels would allow, ducking down an alley. He kicked off the heeled pumps, no time to change clothes, yanked off his wig, shoved it under his arm, fumbled in his purse for a handkerchief to wipe off the worst of the makeup. His hands shook violently, smearing lipstick and rouge. The police had blocked the end of the alley. He was trapped, pulse pounding in his ears. This was it. He was going to be arrested in full drag, his secret life splashed across the morning papers. His father would likely disown him. He'd lose his job and apartment. His life would be utterly ruined. Stella appeared at his elbow, also already half out of drag. Her eyes were wild with terror. "This way! Hurry!" she hissed. She tugged him behind a stack of empty crates and pointed to a trellis bolted to the wall, leading up to a low rooftop. They scrambled up, clumsy and slipping in their stockinged feet, clinging to the trellis for dear life. Below, Teddy heard the heavy thud of police boots entering the alley. A bright beam of flashlight probed the darkness, sweeping across the ground. They made it to the rooftop and bolted, leaping across to the next building over. Teddy's lungs burned and his legs ached, but he didn't dare slow down, running on pure adrenaline. The rough concrete and gravel tore at his stockings, shredded the delicate soles of his feet. 3 rooftops later, they finally paused, crouching low behind a brick chimney. In the distance, they could still hear shouts and whistles. Teddy's chest heaved with panicked breaths. Stella was shaking violently, makeup streaked down her face with tears and sweat. "That was too close," Teddy panted. The wind from their high perch whipped strands of his wig around his face. He tore it off fully now, along with the satin gloves, annoyance mixing with the sick terror churning his gut. All that money and effort wasted. He hated the police with a sudden, scorching passion. "What will we do?" Stella whimpered. There was a long ladder bolted to the opposite side of the building, leading down to a dead-end alley that opened onto the street. They could climb down and hopefully blend into the late-night crowds, finding their way home. But it required crossing directly in front of a row of lit windows. Teddy crept to the edge and peered down. No sign of police on the street. They had to risk it. Every minute they lingered increased the likelihood of getting caught. His still pounding heart clenched at the possibility. "We go quickly and quietly," he whispered to Stella. "Keep your head down. Avoid the light." He went first, moving swiftly to the top of the ladder. The metal was cold under his shredded stockings. He took a deep breath and started climbing down, the rungs pressing painfully into his injured feet. Halfway down, a window just to his right suddenly flew open. Teddy froze, heart in his throat. He flattened himself against the brick wall, hardly daring to breathe. Light and laughter spilled out from the apartment. He heard the clink of glasses, smelled cigarette smoke. A man leaned out, tapping ash from his cigarette. He looked left, right. For a moment, his gaze passed directly over Teddy, no more than 5 feet away from him. Teddy held his breath, pulse roaring in his ears. The smudged makeup and tattered dress felt like a lit beacon, spotlighting his shame and degeneracy. But the man didn't see him, turning back to speak to someone inside. The momentary spike of terror passed. Teddy forced his shaking limbs to keep moving down. The instant his feet hit the alley floor, he ran. Stella thudded down a moment later, chasing his echoing footsteps. They burst out onto the street, into the flow of oblivious pedestrians and rumbling motor cars. No one spared them a second glance. They parted without a word, hurrying off in different directions. There was no room for relief yet. He was still a man in a dress, in public, in danger with every clicking step of his heels. Teddy's legs ached with exhaustion as he limped the final blocks to his apartment. Only when the door closed and locked behind him, shutting out the world, did he finally sink to the floor and allow the nervous sobs to take over, knees drawn up to his chest, arms wrapped protectively around himself. Violent shivers racked through him, his body belatedly processing the terror and adrenaline. Off in the distance, police sirens still wailed, carrying on the night wind. Teddy wondered sickly how many of his friends had been caught tonight. How many lives potentially ruined? The glittering haven of their community felt shattered, tainted. Danger and shame crept back in like choking vines. With shaking hands, he pried himself off the floor and stumbled to the bathroom. He stared at his streaked reflection, taking in the smeared lipstick, the runny mascara, the tattered, filthy dress and stockings. Adora, usually so glamorous and defiant, looked like a sad, tragic parody. He stripped off the ruined clothing and turned on the shower, twisting the knob as hot as it would go. Clouds of steam filled the small room. He stepped under the scalding spray, hissing as it hit his abraded feet, his bruised knees, his aching shoulders. The water sluiced over him, washing away the last traces of Adora, the makeup, the glitter, the feminine mystique. He became just Teddy again, the boring, invisible file clerk. A wave of bitter despair overtook him. How long could he keep risking everything for a few moments of being his true self? Was it really worth this ever-present danger, the gut-clenching anxiety? He wanted to be brave and defiant, to spit in the face of society's scorn and live as he pleased. But on nights like this, the weight of reality crushed down on him. The constant fear of exposure, the risk of losing everything, the total lack of acceptance from the normal world. It felt like an impossible dream, a future always dangling just out of his grasp. Still, even with the terror of the night still vibrating through his veins, he knew he'd do it again. He couldn't go back to a half-life, denying his fundamental self. Maybe he'd have to be more discreet, take additional precautions, choose events more carefully. But he couldn't lock Adora away forever. He emerged from the shower, toweled off, and slipped on his pajamas. The sky outside his small window was just beginning to pale with pre-dawn light. He slid under the covers, body aching and heavy. A few scant hours, and he'd put on the gray suit, the hat, the mask of respectable masculinity. Step back into the real world that refused to acknowledge him as he truly was. But he'd survived another close call. Adora had survived. And despite everything, that knowledge sparked a small, stubborn ember of warmth in his chest. He hugged it close as he fell into an exhausted sleep. They would survive, and keep fighting to exist, as long as he had breath in his body. It was the only choice, really. For himself, and for all the glittering children who would come after him, dreaming of a better, freer world. The day dawned gray and dreary, a fitting match for Teddy's exhausted, anxious mood as he dragged himself out of bed. His body ached from the previous night's mad dash across the rooftops, and his mind buzzed with worry over which of his friends might now be behind bars, their lives upended. He moved through his morning routine mechanically, wincing as he slid his bruised feet into the dull brown Oxfords, buttoned up the starched white shirt that always felt like a straitjacket. In the tiny bathroom mirror, he finger-combed his hair into the respectable side part and gave his reflection a grimace. Theodore stared back, boring, awkward, invisible. The sparkling confidence of Adora felt like a fading dream. At the office, he kept his head down, sorting and filing papers with robotic precision. But his mind was far away, thoughts swirling with the events of the previous night, the terrifying brush with disaster. It had been far too close. He knew he should feel lucky to have escaped unscathed. But the fear sat like a lead weight in his stomach, warring with the defiant voice in his head that whispered he couldn't let them win. He couldn't slink back into the shadows, forever denying his true self. By the time evening fell, he'd made up his mind. He would go out again tonight. Maybe it was reckless, tempting fate too soon. But he needed to be around his people, needed to reassure himself that their world still existed, bruised but unbroken. As the sky darkened, he slipped out of the office and hurried home, steps quick with nervous anticipation. In the safety of his apartment, he flung open the wardrobe and began expertly assembling his armor. Tonight's gown was a showstopper, a daring creation of shimmering black satin that hugged his narrow waist and fell in graceful folds to the floor. The back dipped low, nearly to his waist, while a cascade of silver fringe adorned the shoulders and skirt, swaying mesmerizingly with every movement. He'd saved for months to afford it, cutting back on meals and skimping on necessities. The minute he saw it in the secret catalog circulated among the queens, he knew it had to be his. The perfect blend of elegance and edge. He took extra care with his makeup, abandoning his usual soft pinks and corals for a bold, smoldering look. He rimmed his eyes with kohl liner, blending it out into a dramatic, smoky effect and adding a pop of shimmering silver at the inner corners. His lips he painted a deep, rich burgundy, the color of dark wine. With his wig, a sleek black bob with razor-sharp bangs, and a pair of delicate silver T-strap heels, the effect was striking. He looked like a jazz-age starlet, a 1920s vamp straight out of a film noir. It was a rather daring look for him. He typically favored a sweeter, more traditionally feminine aesthetic. But tonight he needed the armor of full glamour, needed to become someone fearless and untouchable. The Harlem Renaissance was in full swing, and its boundary-pushing ethos had seeped into the queer underground as well. Black artists, writers, and musicians were challenging traditional norms and celebrating their heritage with unprecedented boldness. Teddy devoured the illicit novels and poems passed from hand to hand, marveling at the daring sensuality, the open expressions of queer desire. He listened hungrily to the race records that trickled down to their clandestine gatherings, the jazz and blues that seemed to vibrate with raw feeling and barely concealed double meanings. This new wave of cultural pride and artistic experimentation was electrifying, even to a white boy from the suburbs like himself. It gave him a glimpse of what true freedom and self-expression could look like. The Harlem Renaissance creators used their art as a weapon, a tool of defiance and liberation in a hostile world. They carved out spaces of joy and resilience against all odds. He tried to channel some of that subversive spirit as he put the finishing touches on his look, squaring his shoulders and lifting his chin. Adora was his personal rebellion, his internal renaissance. He would keep nurturing her flame, even in the face of danger. As he navigated the darkened streets towards the secret ball location, he felt the familiar knot of anxiety and anticipation tightening his stomach. Every flicker of movement made him start, fearing the flash of a police badge in the shadows. He varied his route, making abrupt turns and circuitous loops to throw off any potential followers. The clicking of his heels against the damp pavement sounded unnaturally loud, but as he slipped in the back entrance of the dingy warehouse, the tension began to unspool from his knotted muscles. The bass thump of music vibrated up through the soles of his feet, and the humid air was thick with cigarette smoke and perfume. Everywhere was a riot of color and shimmer, jewel-toned gowns and glittering headdresses, glossy wigs and painted faces. Familiar faces called out greetings and waved him over for air kisses and gossip. He scanned the crowd anxiously for Stella and the others, needing to reassure himself they'd made it out. The atmosphere was subdued compared to normal, an undercurrent of tension and grim determination beneath the glitter and laughter. They all knew the stakes, knew how quickly their haven could be shattered. But there was defiance, too, a hardened resolve to keep carving out this space for themselves, even in a world determined to erase them. Adora made her entrance to appreciative whoops and whistles, the silver fringe of her gown catching the light and shimmering hypnotically as she sashayed through the crowd. She preened under the admiration, flirting and laughing. But Teddy felt like there was a thin pane of glass between himself and the merriment. He was still remembering the acrid fear-sweat stench of the previous night, the bruising grip of Stella's fingers on his arm as they fled. His smile felt painted on, slightly desperate. Just stay to the shadows, he told himself. Be alert. Have your wits about you and your escape route planned, just in case. But all thoughts of danger momentarily fell away when the MC announced the next category: Butch Queen Up in Pumps. Teddy sucked in a sharp breath, his heartbeat quickening with a thrill of anticipation. This category was for drag queens serving masculine realness, the ability to blend in and pass as male while still walking the runway in full feminine glam. It was a sly, subversive wink at their double lives, the constant code switching they had to master to survive. The competitors lined up, postures slouching into exaggerated machismo, puffed out chests, splayed legs, jutting chins. With the beat of the music, they stalked down the makeshift catwalk, attitude brash and strutting. But then, midway through, they shifted seamlessly into femme, hips swaying, hands gracefully elongated, spines swaying sinuously as if underwater. The crowd lost it, screaming their approval. There was something electrifying about that brazen fluidity, the shameless claiming of both masculinity and femininity in one body. It felt like an act of rebellion, a defiant refusal to be caged into society's rigid binaries. Watching them, Teddy felt something unfurling inside his chest, a slowly dawning revelation. All this time, he'd felt like he had to choose between Teddy and Adora, the boy and the queen, flipping a switch to become one or the other, depending on the context. But what if there was a way to be both, to let them bleed into each other? What if his love of satin and lace made him no less of a man? What if he didn't have to amputate half of himself to fit in? He thought of the queer Harlem poets, weaving sensual, unapologetic odes to same-sex love and gender nonconformity. He thought of the blues singers, belting out sly lyrics of female lovers and male heartbreakers. Those artists presented a vision of life outside the neat, stifling boxes of proper society, a world where masculine and feminine, straight and queer existed on a fluid spectrum rather than as fixed categories. Maybe there was space in that world for him too, just as he was, with no parts denied or suppressed. Maybe liberation for him didn't have to mean moving fully from one gender to another, but rather letting them intermingle, finding freedom not in a fixed destination, but in the journey itself. The thought made his heart race, his breath shallow in his suddenly tight chest. The ball felt alive with new possibilities, transformed from a refuge of necessary secrecy to a space of joyful, subversive world-making. Teddy looked around at the defiant, glittering throng with new eyes, seeing the radical self-crafting, the experiments in desire and embodiment taking place all around. He couldn't put a name to the new feeling sparking to life in his chest yet, some combination of pride, hunger, and determination. But as he watched the butch queens saunter off the runway to raucous applause, heads high and eyes glinting, he knew one thing for certain. He was going to find his place in this patchwork quilt of a community, and in doing so, finally find a home within his own skin. Newly energized, he threw himself into the rest of the ball, drinking, dancing, and laughing with reckless, cathartic release. The specter of danger still lurked, but it felt less immediate, a problem to be tackled rather than an unchangeable reality to hide from. When the ball finally ended in the wee hours of the morning, he slipped out into the misty gray light of pre-dawn, still vibrating with excitement and possibility. Other attendees trickled out alongside him in twos and threes, peeling off towards home. "Until next time," they called to one another. "Stay safe out there." "You too," Teddy murmured. He was already mentally plotting his look for the next ball. He wanted something a little more subversive, a little more boundary-pushing. Maybe he'd experiment with a daring tuxedo gown hybrid, the ultimate melding of masc and femme. He turned toward home with a secret smile playing around his lips, the silver fringe of Adora's gown catching the first rays of sunlight and sparkling as if encrusted with diamonds. The day ahead loomed with all its drab demands and stifling conventionality, but now he felt fortified by a new strength, a new certainty. The world wanted him fractured, wanted him to carve away his truest self, to make himself small and legible and non-threatening. But he refused. He would find a way to knit together all the disparate strands of his identity, to evolve beyond the neat, rigid lines drawn around gender and sexuality. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to meet it as his whole, uncompromised self. He climbed the stairs to his apartment and slipped inside, locking the door behind him. For a long moment, he simply leaned against it, eyes closed, still half in the dreamy space of the ball. The room was silent save for the soft ticking of the clock and his own steady breathing. A smile bloomed across his face. He pushed off the door, kicked off his heels, and started the careful process of becoming Teddy again, shedding Adora like an outgrown chrysalis. But this time, he didn't feel like he was losing her. She was still there, an ember glowing steadily in his chest. He would carry her with him, letting her light suffuse his days, until the next time he could burst into technicolor flame. A new day was dawning, in more ways than one. And Teddy, all of Teddy, Adora, and Theodore alike, was ready to meet it head-on, shimmering and triumphant. He had a feeling that soon the whole world would be forced to sit up and take notice. The Renaissance was only just beginning. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out Patreon for a lot more content and early access to YouTube videos.